Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. This is my first video for Humanities 105. This is our discussion on Alan Locke and the Great Migration and Zora. I kind of wanted to give us a couple of weeks to kind of really allow things to kind of allow us as a class to kind of get in the groove, allow some of the content to really start to connect. And a lot of you are really doing great work with that. So I wanted to take some time and give you all some shout outs, give y'all some feedback as well. Also, I know it's written, I've written it a few times, but please be mindful to respond to a classmate so you can receive full credit and that you are following the directions for the discussions. Okay. I also like to leave comments in the comment section of your discussion post. Sometimes I'll just put like, hey, great job, great work, or I'll give you feedback about things. Just depends on the week or the day or what is written. But my first shout out goes to Natalie. Bringing up Africa Town is is awesome stuff. I really appreciate you bringing that up as we talk about Zora. Excuse me. Sometimes I don't get the opportunity to really go in depth with a lot of the people we discuss and the history because there's limited time in this course. But I really appreciate when students bring their knowledge. And I think that's one of the things I'm trying to foster here is an opportunity and space for you all to bring in your knowledge. Like, who was it? Laura, you were talking about your time in Chicago, right? And I think that's really important that you're discussing the residual effects of slavery, of Jim Crow, of the Great Migration as it pertains to your hometown of Chicago. And that even got Natalie in that conversation as well, right? So it's really awesome for us to be able to share this knowledge and not just, you know, for me, it doesn't just make my space better. It makes our space better. It helps your fellow classmates learn a lot more, not just about you, but about the world. I find, and maybe those who have traveled a lot will agree with me, I find that the more you travel, the more of the world you see, the more of America you see, the more your perspectives change, the more you learn about the different histories, the different cultures. The more your perspectives change, you really learn a lot. You know, when you sit in your little bubbles, it can be really restricting, almost as if you haven't really lived, you know. And so I encourage you all, you know, love your spaces, love your homes, but step outside of them, step outside of those comfort zones. I always say the best parts of our life exist outside of our comfort zones, and I will live and die on those words. But yeah, Natalie, Laura, thank you for sharing that personal knowledge and those personal experiences. And while we're on the topic of Laura, you know, you were talking about the lasting and residual effects of the history, right, of the Great Migration, of Jim Crow, as you see that. And I think that gives us the opportunity to connect this history with current conditions in America, current social problems and concerns in America. One of the biggest questions I get in most of my classes when we discuss the history is, you know, why is this valuable, or how is this valuable, and why is this important? And I think it's important to understand how close this history is. I think it was Natalie, you were talking about how close some of these dates feel, and they do, and they are, right? My grandfather was born in 1917. My grandfather was born in 1917. He was the youngest of 11 children, and his father was 51 or 50 when he had him. So if we do the math on that, right? That means that his father, so my grandfather's father, was born in 1865, 1866, right? What happened in 1865 and 1866? The Emancipation Proclamation, right? Effectively ending or effectively making slavery illegal unless convicted of a crime. But we'll get to that later in the quarter. And so that's how close it is, right? My grandfather's father was born probably into slavery or at the very end of slavery, right? That's how close the history is. But we often discuss it as if it was hundreds and hundreds, as if it was 300-400 years ago. And it is not that. And so we still feel those effects. And so, Laura, I really appreciate you bringing in that history of Chicago. And I do agree with Natalie is that Chicago is kind of one of those cities that encapsulates so much about American history and about Black history. And I know a lot of our content here, this is a Black Thought and Culture class, and our content is Black history. But what I want us to ultimately get to understanding is that Black history is American history. It is just an American history that has been divided and thus has to be expressed and taught individually on its own. But it is no different. This is all American history. It has all happened in America. It is a product of American culture. It is a product of American establishments and foundations. And so I hope that becomes evident as we get deeper and deeper into the history. But I think we're seeing a lot of the connections that this history has with modern culture. And I appreciate a lot of you for making those connections. Because I think one of the connections that I talk about the most during this section is the duality of people, the two-ness, right? And Mariah, you talked a lot about that, right? You compared the sort of two-ness of Zora or the fight against that two-ness. And then the two-ness of Du Bois, what Du Bois talked about. And that typically I refer to as that duality of minorities specifically. And that sort of duality has kind of evolved to really apply to anyone who doesn't align with American established social norms and expectations, right? You tend to have to build this two-ness where you can be inherently one thing and also inherently yourself at the same time. You can be accepted and also be who you are, who may not necessarily be accepted in that space. And I find it most prominent today in minorities, in first generation citizens here. I'm starting to see it more commonly fought against in the LGBTQ plus community. I think there is a lot of desire to fight against that need for a two-ness and allowing them to be themselves and to express themselves in that way. And so I see a lot of fight against that two-ness, which is awesome to see, because I think at some level, we have to understand that when we force people to split themselves internally for a social or external purpose, we are not authentically giving our fellow man, a fellow human being, an opportunity to be themselves. And thus we cannot learn them. We cannot understand them. And I think it just creates a divide, an unnecessary divide. I think we need to genuinely know people. We need to genuinely know our neighbors. Genuinely understand our neighbors, so that we can not only grow as a community, but grow as individuals. Anyway, I digress. But I think those perspectives, a lot of the things that you all are pulling from the text are really important. Alea, I hope I'm pronouncing names right here today. You brought out the quote from Locke. It says, to see himself in the distorted perspective of a social problem. You pointed that quote out, and that's one of my favorite quotes from the text, mainly because I think it is something that still applies. I think those that see themselves as a social problem begin to have a really uncomfortable experience in society, regardless of where that society is, but in keeping to American society, right? The way we talk about homosexuality and the LGBTQ plus community here in America, the way we talk about other religions here in America, specifically the Muslim and Islamic faith, the way we discuss women here in America. And, you know, we create these divisive conversations about social concerns, and the way in which we convey these things publicly, we create this distorted perspective for people to view themselves as social problems, not as human beings, but as social problems. And I think that's where we are today in a lot of ways, right? We are creating divisive discussions about how we think society should be run and what is acceptable and what isn't. Rather than getting to know people, getting to understand their experiences, which is always my concern about how we view and discuss things. We tend, at least historically, we tend to discuss things in a very black and white, pun intended, but very black and white, when there's a lot of gray area to issues and social concerns. But you know, I find that the discussions you all are having is exactly what I hope for, and I just wanted to praise you all for that work and shout out some of you individually. Crystal brought up a good quote about from Locke, one of my other favorites, when he says that, you know, blacks are socially despised, artistically esteemed, but culturally influential, right? And I think about that all the time, right? You know, when I was younger, much younger, in the early 90s, when race relations seemed to be at a height, especially with, you know, a lot of the occurrences in the 90s, and we'll go through that later in the quarter. You know, I always heard conversations of adults talking about how they love people of color when we're winning, you know, in sports, or when we're representing America and we're making us look great, right? But in any other matters of American culture, right, American progress, we are kind of left out of that conversation. And although I think that conversation and those kind of perspectives have gotten better and evolved, I think there's still some validity in people who feel that way. But, you know, like I said, I think a lot of these perspectives have shifted to other minority groups, other marginalized groups, being socially despised, but being artistically esteemed and being culturally influential, right? I think about the influence that the LGBTQ plus community is having on America. Depending on your perspective, you might view that as for better or for worse, but I do agree, regardless, they are having an artistically esteemed influence and a cultural influence in America. Yet they are, as a group, you know, there's a divide. There's a divide there. Anyway, I constantly talk about the intersectionality of culture, right? That it's not always just race. It's not always just class. It's not always just gender. More often than not, it's a combination of all three, usually at least two. You'll find that a lot of the things that we're discussing are not just racial issues, but they're also class issues. But yeah, I digress. Crystal, you also talked about the confidence of Zora, right? During a time period where she was probably surrounded by hate, both from the white community, but also maybe within the black community, you know, sort of despising her confidence level, right? And I think you're kind of touching on the growth and the existence of like that internalized oppression, right? Those that accepted themselves as a social problem, or those that accepted themselves as the socially despised, right? And I think that still exists today. I think you have a lot of people who struggle with their identity and what that means in the broader sense of society. I've reached my max time. I try to keep these at 15 minutes or under, and I'm already at 15 minutes. But mostly because I feel like students don't watch past like 10, 12 minutes. But anyway, I just thought these were really awesome. One last thing, Dakota, you talked about Locke's foresight for the contributing factors to the Great Migration, how he was talking about it in that moment. And then, we fast forward nearly 100 years and we are referencing those very things as the things that contributed to the migration. And you'll find that a lot in the people that we're going to discuss in this class, is they had great foresight. But it's not necessarily just foresight. They saw the reality, right? They did not allow media or popular social opinion to dictate what they thought. And that's what I encourage you all to do in this class, is to not allow popular opinion to dictate what you think, but allow your own education and your own understanding and the perspectives of those that are involved and those that are experiencing it in the moment to dictate how you understand the history and how you understand the experiences and how you understand your fellow community members. But anyway, for those of you that were able to watch all of this, thank you for your time. I'll try to do these every week or every other week, especially when we have really good conversations. So thank you for the content and have a great rest of your week.